Good morning, UCA. Oh, it's so good to see all of you again. It has been since last summer since I stood before you. And a lot has happened, hasn't it? We're going to talk about a little bit of that later, but right now I want to talk to you about Black History Month. I want to tell you a story I experienced over 30 years ago when I was a sergeant stationed in Germany in the mid-'80s. I know, the mid-'80s, right? My first sergeant asked me to give a presentation to the soldiers of my battery on Black History Month. For those of you who may not know, a first sergeant is the highest ranking sergeant in a company or a battery. And so he really wasn't asking. It was like a soft order. And it was really not an option to say, I'd rather not. And I'd rather not. He gave me a few sheets of paper with the accomplishments of about 5 famous Black people in American history. And you know, it's always the same 5 Black people, like no other Black people in all of American history has ever done anything except for Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver Jr., Rosa Parks, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, don't get me wrong, their accomplishments was impactful and great. And the accomplishments of Black Americans should be lauded. But that's not my point, which I will get to a little later. So I looked over the notes and I thought to myself, first, I'm not qualified. I was like in my 20s. I'm not qualified to teach anyone about Black history due to my inability to even remember or articulate what I learned so many years ago as a teenager. Second, the notes again were brief excerpts of African Americans' accomplishments in America, and definitely did not mention anything about the impact slavery had on Africans as a people, or the impact on our nation. And third, there was no explanation for the need of a separate historical narrative of a people that had been in America before the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. Since I couldn't remember all I had learned as a teenager from a book titled Before the Mayflower, A History of the Negro in America from 1619 to 1962 by Loren Bennett, I used the deficient notes the first sergeant gave me. I gave a very uncomfortable spiel to my fellow soldiers, of which 75% were of European American descent. And they all seemed to look at me like, how is this information relevant or useful to me? To which I gave them a look back to say, it's relevant, but I just don't know how to explain it to you. It's amazing all that can be conveyed in a look. After the presentation, I went uneasily about my day with a silent but nagging desire. You see, I wish I had remembered what I read in Before the Mayflower. I wish I could have told them of the importance of knowing a true American history that included the history of African Americans and not the segregated, sanitized history we all have been taught. I wish I could have told them what I found out about Black history in that book, that it is American history untold. Now, it's important to know that that book, Before the Mayflower, was not a part of my high school curriculum. I didn't learn any of those things in school. But it found its way into my household through a family friend. And it spilled out before me things I was not told in my history class or my social studies class. It was filled with ancient African kingdoms and city-states of great power and wealth, which up to that point I have never even heard of, with the exception of Egypt and Timbuktu. I devoured the information in that book because it not only highlighted the accomplishments of African Americans throughout American history, but it also laid out the historical journey of the enslaved Africans that was interwoven into each historical period of our country. It told a whole and complete story of our nation from its very beginnings and solidified that Africans were here, not by choice, but they were here nonetheless. It also told the sad but important truth that chattel slavery was one of the oldest institutions in our country since it began in 1619. From the settlement of Jamestown, to the forming of the 13 colonies, to the American Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase, the westward expansion, the Civil War, to the Reconstruction period, to the Jim Crow era of sanctioned apartheid. I believe you get the point when I say that blacks were and have always been a part of American history, interwoven through all of its pivotal periods. Not just as the enslaved, no, but as freedom fighters, abolitionists. They were soldiers in the American Revolution, the Civil War, and all the wars fought thereafter. They were insurrectionists fighting for justice from the brutal and humane treatment that they experienced. They became congressmen and statesmen during the Reconstruction period and helped enact laws that benefit everyone, including free education, which was not a thing in the 1800s. Alas, I hadn't remembered the valuable storehouse of information soon enough to tell my fellow soldiers that Black history is American history. And I couldn't answer their unspoken question of relevance or usefulness to them or even to myself. I didn't tell them how for centuries enslaved Africans had suffered and endured some of the most immoral and horrendous treatment of any people on earth. I didn't tell them that the wealth of our nation was because of the lust of agricultural profit made possible by the free labor of the enslaved. I didn't tell them that so many laws had been passed to make the enslaved African not human, but mere chattel to do with whatever the enslaver pleased. I didn't tell them that a true telling of our history has for centuries been omitted and even forbidden, as it would tarnish the image of the so-called land of the free and home of the brave. You see, if Black history had always been a part of American history's narrative, then we, as young high school and college students, would have learned that one of the nation's founders, Thomas Jefferson, while drafting the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, which begins so beautifully with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Great words, inspiring words, uplifting words. If our history told the whole truth, we would have learned that he was not a planter, as our history books described him. No, for he planted nothing. But he was an enslaver of over 200 humans when he penned those words. Our history books would have enlightened us to that fact and pointed out that during that period of time, those words were not meant for women. They were not meant for the indigenous natives, and they definitely were not meant for the enslaved Africans. If Black history was interwoven into American history, then we all would have known that as a result of restrictive and inhumane laws that were passed in the 16th, 17th, and 1800s, we would have known that the enslaved Africans had no autonomy over their own bodies and no free will for centuries, and that the system of policing and violence towards Blacks served to keep them submissive and from revolting and from running away. And that such policing continued through our nation's history, especially during the post-Reconstruction period, and has a direct correlation to the way Blacks are profiled and policed to this very day. We would know that Black Lives Matter is a truth that has been denied utterance for centuries and is still being discredited to this very day. You see, Black history shouldn't be just a recanting of Black accomplishments, which are vastly more than we have been led to believe. But it should be how the enslaved Africans' journey and treatment in this country was a part of every period, every war, and how the frenzy for limited profit for capitalistic agriculture made possible by the free labor of the enslaved also made it necessary. It made it necessary to reduce the enslaved Africans to subhuman status based on the color of their skin. This form of prejudice and subjugation continues to exist to this very day across all of societal structures and institutions. Had we learned all of this, truly learned about American history in this manner, then perhaps we would have seen the signs that a very unjust and cruel history was about to repeat itself again. Therein lies the relevance and important point about telling the truth about history. It's that hidden history, history untold, history denied, runs the high and dangerous risk of repeating itself. And our history has and continues to deny the unalienable rights of Blacks, women of all groups, Hispanics, Indigenous Americans, immigrants, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community. History is repeating itself right before our eyes, and the news is riddled with an administration that is pulling from the playbooks of Jim Crow era and Nazi Germany. That is why telling the truth about our history is relevant and essential, no matter how hard it is to face. And it is hard. I read 5 different books to prepare this talk. And I cried. Oh, I cried. If our history was complete, we would have learned that the Nazis came to America in the 1930s and studied our system of segregation, and that they revered the Jim Crow laws that discriminated against Black Americans. They even debated whether to introduce similar segregation in their own country, in Germany. The Nazis, however, didn't think that the Jim Crow laws went far enough, and that ended in the mass killings of millions of human beings and World War II. If we were taught the relevance of American history and world history, we would know that what is happening in our country right now happened in Nazi Germany, where they conducted mass deportations, mass imprisonment, persecution of political opponents, the repression, denial, and/or distortion of historical facts, the demonization of a group of people based on their ethnicity and religious beliefs, vilifying the transgender community. And yes, Germany had a transgender community before the Nazi regime. And the genocide of millions of Jews, members of the LGBT community, gypsies, the disabled, and any group they deem degenerate and the enemy from within. Any of this sound familiar? Right now, there is a concerted effort to eradicate the truth about Black history. It is happening all across states and legislatures, and now even the federal government. They're trying to stop projects like critical race theory and the 1619 Project. The last time I got my hair done, my hairdresser told me that her daughter's history book described enslaved Africans as indentured servants. So I gather you know what an indentured servant is. And for those who do not know, an indentured servant was a European American that entered into a contract for servitude, usually for about a period of 7 years, and this was back in the 16th and 17th century, and they would be freed from said contract on completion of the specified term. Now I ask you, what enslaved African in this country, in our history, ever fit that description? Now, I'm telling you this not to sadden you or to invoke guilt. Oh, no. I'm telling you this because if we had a true telling of American history that included Black history, then we could see that history is repeating itself in this country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are under attack, and there is a laser focus of gutting all of our civil diversity, equity, and inclusion, and any economic gain we have made since 1964. And please know, the Civil Rights Act is not just about protecting Black people, it's a law that protects all people. Please read it, Google it. Please educate yourself on these laws that were meant to liberate and protect us all. Again, if it was a true telling of American history, then perhaps we would have also been taught about radical compassion and how to reconcile and heal the gross injustice inflicted upon millions of people, instead of hiding from the ugly truth of the past, which still has left an open, festering wound on our American psyche. We have a choice to make. For you see, the time for justice is always the present moment. We have come too far to turn back now. The time is to stand up for our unalienable rights. And unalienable rights mean that these rights are not transferable or not capable of being taken away or denied. They're trying, but they can't do it. So it's time to stand up for our undeniable rights. And we are the ones that can make the words of the founders of this nation real and breathe the breath of life and truth into them. As we enter the dawn of a new era, a new period in our American history, we no longer have the luxury to wait and see who will take the lead for justice, for equality, just for what's right. We don't have the time. The appointed time is now, and we are the change agents. Say that, we are the change agents. We have been told to stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. The reason why we were told this is so that we can see a little further, so we can reach a little higher, that we are not deterred by fear or the atrocities that the dark past has taught us or what the present moment is showing us, but so that we can see a way forward through all of this chaos. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to us about character and strength, and he said the ultimate measure of a man, a human being, is that is not where he stands or they stand in moments of convenience and comfort, but where they stand at times of challenge and controversy. Now is not the time to acquiesce in the face of injustice. Now is the time for us to stand together in these challenging times for life, for true liberty, for diversity, inclusion, for all the things that we hold true, and for the true pursuit of happiness. And please, let us all stay woke.